Welcome everyone. In this video, I want to talk about quoting and give you a practical way of framing your quotes in your argument. So the first thing I want to talk about is what is the purpose of quotes? Why do we use them? So quotes are a type of evidence, and they are a type of evidence that gives us a lot of credibility as writers. So when we use a quote, we're using testimony from a source that we have used to support our own opinion on a topic. And what we're basically communicating to our readers is that, listen, I have this opinion on a topic. It's backed up by this expert on a topic. And here is what they're saying. And I'm presenting to you clearly what they're saying without altering any of their words. So quotes function as a type of insurance on evidence. Like, wow, okay, this person isn't distorting this other person's words. So they're really great for establishing your credibility and presenting evidence. Now, there are some bad habits to avoid when using quotes. Some of the things I've noticed in my career as a writing teacher is that sometimes writers quote too little. So their whole argument is filled with opinions, but they're not backing it up with the evidence that I need to be convinced to support their opinions. The other extreme is that sometimes I see writers who quote way too much. Their argument is filled with quotes, but it's missing analysis. It's missing interpretation of those quotes. It's missing a connection to their opinions. It's just a collection of quotes. And so you want to avoid those few things. But the biggest bad habit I see is when writers assume that quotes speak for themselves. And what I mean by this is I've seen papers where someone just put a quote in a paper and expected me to understand how that quote supports their opinion. Like, they expect me to know where they got that quote. Like, I get so confused not knowing, like, where's this quote from? Who said this quote? How does this relate to the entire paper? And you want to avoid this in your writing as much as possible. So we'll talk through how to do that. But the first thing, before we do that, let's talk about how to pick relevant quotes, because that's an important conversation to have. So try to go pick quotes through this method. You want to first start by knowing what your opinion is on a topic. In other words, you want to have a main point. Like, what is the main point you're trying to get across in your writing? Once you know your main point, then you can look at the stuff that you've researched, the sources that you've researched, and then you can pick a relevant quote that you feel logically supports the opinion you're trying to get across to readers. So start with your main point and then choose a quote. Don't just choose a quote from random and then try to make it work into your argument. I feel that's like a harder step to do. Once you've picked your quote, you got to think about how you're going to frame your quote. And so framing quotes effectively is probably the biggest challenge for writers. Because I think as writers, we pick a quote because we think it connects to our argument. We think it makes sense to us. But we don't take the time to actually frame it for our readers in such a way that readers know background information like, oh, where did this quote come from? Who said this quote? Who's the author? And then, oh, what does this quote mean to the writer? And how does this quote support this writer's opinion on the topic? And these are steps. These are the things that you frame around your quote to make a full argument. So I want you to read over this example, pause the video, and as you read over this example, read it as someone who's trying to understand how this quote fits in the argument. What's missing? So pause the video and then we'll come back. Great. Hopefully you paused the video and you looked at that example and you asked yourself questions that related to how does this quote fit in this person's argument? If you're like me, you probably experienced a few questions like, who is Susan Bordeaux? That's something the quote doesn't give you. You're kind of left to figure that out on your own. And you don't want to do that when you're writing an essay. You want to give readers this information because just because you have a quote in your argument from someone, that person may not be a reliable authority on that topic. You don't want to get a quote from just anyone. You want to get a quote from someone who has relevant credentials and experience on the topic that you're writing about. So I don't know who Susan Bordeaux is. Why should I even trust her? Secondly, the writer in that example doesn't even tell us why Susan Bordeaux, what they think Susan Bordeaux is right about. They just insert a quote and they say, yeah, she's right. Right about what? So we need more analysis there. We need more context. And then the last thing, we don't even know if those are Susan Bordeaux's words. Yeah, we can infer that the writer says they mention Susan Bordeaux and then the next sentence is this large quote, but that leaves some ambiguity. So that first example is an example of how not to insert quotes. In the next example that I want you to see what's different. So look at this example. You can pause the video if you want to and see how the writer answers those questions that the first example did not answer in terms of who Susan Bordeaux is, why she's relevant on the topic, and also why the reader agrees with her opinion. Why the writer agrees with her opinion. Okay, hopefully you had a chance to pause and read over this quote. And as you can see, in this example, the quote is framed so much better. The writer lets us know who Susan Bordeaux is, why she's important on the topic. They give us a brief summary that's, relevant to what the main point the writer is trying to get across. And then they set up the quote with some analysis in terms of why it's important for their topic. And I want you to do the same in your own writing. So let's talk about a practical way to do that in your own writing. I'm very much indebted to this book called They Say, I Say, and I use it in my classes. And one of the ideas in They Say, I Say is this idea of quotation sandwiches, quotation sandwiching. So think of a sandwich, right? Sandwich has 2 slices of bread, and in the middle there's some kind of meat, tofu, or substance, right? So I want you to think of your quote, of framing your quote as like framing it inside of a sandwich. In the first layer, the first slice of bread, the top slice of bread, you want to give readers some introductory information. Then the substance itself, the stuff between the slices of bread, is the actual quote. And then the bottom slice of bread would be your analysis. So let's break that down a little more. Now think of this as a metaphor in terms of how you can frame your quotes. So top slice of bread, right? Let's say you have your main point. You write it down in your paragraph. My main point is the following. Now, once you're done with that sentence, you're ready to introduce evidence to support that main point, right? But before you do that, you have to introduce your evidence to readers by giving them some background context. That way, they're more likely to accept your evidence. And if they're more likely to accept your evidence, they're more likely to accept your main point, which is the whole point of writing. So here are some things you can include when you introduce your quote. State the full name of the author if you haven't introduced them before. Give us some credentials of the author. Like, why are they an authority on the topic that you're writing about? Why are they relevant on the topic that you're writing about? You could give the title of the article. You can give a brief, tailored, specific summary of key points that relate to the main point that you're trying to get across. I have a little example there that you can see. Okay, now that you are done introducing your quote, you move on to the next step, the meat tofu substance between the slices. And this is probably the easiest part of organizing your ideas when you're inserting a quote. If you already have a quote that you want to use, you basically just use a signal phrase. And if you can see right here, Dweck reports, that word right here in my example, that's a signal phrase. And it's signaling to readers that Carol Dweck is the one who says this quote. And it's like dialogue to make it clear and unambiguous that these words belong to her. So you insert the quote with a signal phrase and, if possible, some type of in-text citation. Now, we move on to the bottom slice of bread. From the bottom slice of bread, you can break it down into 2 parts. Part one would be to interpret the quote in your own words. In other words, what does the quote mean for you? And this is really important. because the way you interpret evidence might be different from the way someone else interprets evidence. So if you just say, my main point is the following, and here's a quote to support it, and you leave it at that, a reader may look at that quote and read that quote differently, and they may come up with a different interpretation. And they might come up with an interpretation that's completely opposite to your own main point. And so they might then be convinced to believe the opposite of what you want to convince them to accept. So take some time after you've inserted the quote to interpret the quote in your own words. Put it in your own words. What does it mean for you? Like, what is she saying in your mind? Now, once you've done that part, go to part 2. And this is the other important part. You want to connect how that quote that you've inserted supports your main point. Obviously, you chose this quote because you think you see some logical connection to your main point. Well, now you have to take the time and explain it to readers. Again, readers can't read your mind. You have to be as clear as possible in terms of saying, this quote supports my main point because, and it could be as simple as a statement like that, starting by like, this evidence supports my main point because, and going from there. But you have to take the time to to show the connection to readers as to why your quote supports your main point. Okay, let's just look at an example now, which is similar to the example I had in the PowerPoint. So let's just say you're starting off with the following main point as an example in terms of how to frame this quote. And my main point in this example is believing that you can't expand your intelligence is a self-defeating belief. Now, once I have my main point, I introduce my evidence. I present evidence and I present analysis. And I'm going to do that by showing you the steps of the quotation sandwich technique. Okay, so I have my main point, and now using the quotation sandwich technique, I'm going to start with my top slice. I'm going to introduce my quote to readers and give them some background information. So as you can see here, I'm stating the title of the article, I'm introducing my writer with their full name, and I'm giving a summary of relevant information that I think my readers need to know to understand my main point. So it's just a summary, okay? After introducing that introduction, I can then insert the quote with a signal phrase. So Dweck reports the following, and I insert the quote. So that's the meat of the quote itself. So after inserting the quote, I go to the bottom slice in our metaphor of framing quotes. I start by giving readers an interpretation of what I think this quote is trying to say. So in other words, I paraphrase it, or I put it in my own words. And then finally, the second part of the bottom slice is my analysis, or my explanation of how this quote supports my main point. So as you see here, this whole section right here is an explanation of how this quote supports my main point. So I try to break it down in a way where you see how I'm organizing my ideas. Here's my main point. Now I'm going to introduce evidence. So here's me introducing my evidence. Here is the actual evidence itself. And then here is my analysis and interpretation of that evidence. So my interpretation comes first and then my analysis. And you can play around with this order, but remember, you want to guide readers to follow your train of thought. And this is what it would look like as a full paragraph. So I'm putting all these ideas together, and this is what I would include in the body of an essay or a piece of writing that I'm including. And that would create overall a full argument. Okay, I hope this video was helpful, and I hope you use the quotation sandwich technique and you choose relevant quotes that support your main points in your writing. All right, thank you.